So, guys, good afternoon. Many of you have been sending me messages telling me to focus my channel more on things other than, educational topics, which I understand. It is more exciting. And that is why today I thought I'd end off my initial series of my podcast channel by talking a little bit about Sri Lanka's history, showing you guys a little bit about my knowledge of Sri Lankan history, which is why I comment on such issues, comparing it a little bit with the world history, and also answering a simple question: where did we go wrong? And can we point those little things out as we talk through this final podcast on Sri Lanka's history? If we were to begin, I would like to talk about, how everyone talks about in 38,000 years ago, the Balangoda Man. That was, in fact, the start of Sri Lanka's cultural legacy. On top of that, you have the arrival of the Buddha. That is, he came three times to Sri Lanka, according to this book called the Mahavansha. And in the Mahavansha, we talk about Prince Vijay's arrival, the spread of Buddhism in Sri Lanka, and they also speak about Sri Lanka's famous kingdoms, such as Anuradhapura and Polonnaruwa. And these kingdoms are very famous kingdoms because at that time, they had some of the best irrigation systems the world had ever seen. Those kingdoms promoted Buddhist art. And of course, they had timeless architecture, is visible even today. So now, fast forwarding to 1505, with the arrival of the Portuguese, who were seeking trade, seeking our spices, they actually built quite a number of forts in Sri Lanka. But they too were faced by strong opposition from our local kings. And then, of course, the Dutch overthrew the Portuguese, introduced great agricultural techniques in Sri Lanka. And then, of course, in 1815, the British came, and the British ruled, I think, till 1948, during which time they introduced rubber plantations, tea plantations, coffee plantations. They improved our railway system, they improved our roads, and unfortunately, hi Billy, hi. And fortunately for us, our leaders, it made them more and more interested actually in gaining independence. It fueled their nationalist sentiments. And then, of course, you have Sri Lanka's independence, which was on the 4th of February 1948. Many of you people know that because, of course, it is a public holiday in Sri Lanka. Our first prime minister, according to my knowledge, was D.S. Senanayake. And D.S. Senanayake actually implemented a parliamentary system that was very similar to the Westminster model. Sri Lanka also during that time implemented its free education policy, which is one of the main reasons why today we still say that we roughly have about 94% literacy rate. I think it was done by the late Minister C.W.W. Kanagara. And of course, finally, during that time, they actually deprived Indian Tamil plantation workers of voting rights. And this was primarily because they wanted to have the Kandy and Sinhalese on their side. I'm, of course, not going to go too much into that, but that is just an example of how things were to play out later on. And then finally, of course, Sri Lanka during the British times, they really focused on road networks that were connected to the tea plantations, the cinnamon plantation, etc., etc. It was the agricultural sector that had to now be improved. And this is where our founding fathers really had a vision for Sri Lanka. And that vision encompassed, for example, the Galloya project, which redirected rivers or whatever you call it to these areas that were much in need of water so that they could cultivate paddy and various other crops that is the staple diet of many Sri Lankans even today. And then, of course, you have in the 1950 the cement factory in KK, Kankasanture, which highlighted Sri Lanka's push for modernization. But one interesting fact to know about KKS is that the government at that time was not interested in running the business. They created a corporation. Now, this is an issue that we're still facing today, whether or not the government should be involved in business. I think you guys all know the answer for that. But just continuing on that route, unfortunately, our founding father died at one point. He tragically fell off a horse and Sri Lanka needed its new leader. So his son Dudley actually took over. Although reluctant, he took over, lacking a lot of experience. He faced massive protests by the Communist Party. I think it's called the LSSP party. Can't pronounce what that means. But he actually was then unable to continue, and he had to actually appoint his uncle, Sir John Kotalawala, to continue his father's legacy of converting forests into agricultural zones. It was, of course, D.S. Senanayaka's legacy to, or at least his vision to make Sri Lanka, at that time Ceylon, self-sufficient in agriculture, something it was not still able to do at that time. But unfortunately, as far as I remember, Sir John Kotalawala also began that whole national language issue, which finally, as you all know, led to many, many, many bad things in the future, such as, the war. And then, of course, you move to 1956, where SWRD Bandaranaike came to power. He actually came to power very similarly because he spoke about this national language issue. He actually started this single only act. Now, the single only act was quite detrimental because a lot of our Tamils and Burghers were actually in the government state apparatus. And this, in fact, alienated them. And according to my knowledge, these Tamils, the Jaffna Tamils who were part of the government service, were great people. These were people that actually kept a high standard, kept our government service functioning properly. And to alienate them is obviously to ask them to leave, which is what they did. And actually, what finally happened was that the Tamil language was taken out of commerce, of education. Now, this was the time when the US and the Soviet Union were fighting their Cold War. So during this time, if I remember correctly, the Soviet Union started the diplomatic relations with Ceylon. I think at this point it was still Ceylon. And they actually helped us to set up our steel mills and our tire factory. This is where it all began actually for Sri Lanka. Now, remember, as I said, when the British left, we didn't even have our industries functioning, which is why our founding father wanted agriculture. Now we're at the stage of trying to look at industries, and I think the Ministry of Industry was created then. And all of this came under this. And finally, I mean, if you look at it, all the countries that actually followed the Soviet model, the communist model, are all countries that finally never did well in the world. And I think this was the start of us trying to follow this model. I remember in 1959, SWRD Bandaranaike was assassinated by a monk. And then I remember his wife became prime minister 1 year later in 1960. Great achievement though, because she was not Sri Lanka, she was the world's first female prime minister. And her policy was quite simple. She wanted to continue this model. She did land reforms, she nationalized industries, and she simply took advantage of the assistance that was being offered by the Soviet Union. And also during her reign, this is where actually racial tensions continued to flourish because, her policies were actually more favored to one side than the other. And this is why, as we go on, you guys know what I'm going to talk about. They're going to start talking about the beginning of the war, or at least significant uprisings that led to the armed rebellion that we had for over 33. And then, of course, you have the 1970s, which was, I think, the first uprising happened then by the JVP. And this was primarily because the educated youth at that time were very frustrated. As you know, there were a lot of things happening in the world those days. As I highlighted in one of my podcasts, the Israel-Arab conflict happened during that time. Oil prices shot up. There was a lot of things happening. So you can't just blame Sri Lanka for their own predicament that they were in. But just carrying on, then you had in 1972, if I remember correctly, the Constitution of Sri Lanka. This is the time that Sri Lanka cut ties with the British monarchy. And I'm sorry for saying Sri Lanka, but actually we became Sri Lanka, the Socialist Democratic Republic of Sri Lanka, from Ceylon at this point in 1972. And and I remember in 1977, J.R. Jayawardena won a landslide victory. People at this point were sick and tired of these socialist policies. J.R. Jayawardena actually became Sri Lanka's first executive president. He had about, I don't know, more than two-thirds in the parliament. So he was able to pass these reforms. He moved Sri Lanka from, basically, he liberalized Sri Lanka. He created open economic reforms. He brought in foreign direct investment. He privatized state owned enterprises. Now, this again is a topic that we are discussing today. 50 years later, our state owned enterprises were privatized at that. And most importantly, the Mahaveli development project, which was begun by Sirimavo, I think, in the 1960s, 1961. I don't know, I have this thing for numbers. But in 1961, she started this project and JR accelerated it. And all of these things were so important to take for Sri Lanka to take itself through this turbulent time in the global economy. And now this is where things get actually really interesting because in the 1980s was the first time Sri Lanka faced an insurrection from two groups. One was the LTT and one was again that JVP uprising. During this time, of course, it was Black July. The LTT was uprisings were now becoming a phenomenon. Then, of course, I'm just going to fast forward because this is obviously, these are the periods where many of you people already know what happened. Many of you are my age. I remember President Premadasa, Ranasinghe Premadasa. I would like to take this opportunity to thank him for his service. Not only did he sacrifice his life for Sri Lanka, but he was the one who introduced garment factories to Sri Lanka. He created free trade zones. Basically, we were able to earn much more money as a result of it. And many of these large garment factories that today is one of Sri Lanka's largest exporter should be credited to him and during his time. But now this is the time now where it was very evident that Sri Lanka's state government apparatus was not functioning properly. There were clearly signs of corruption at this point. That golden era of Sri Lanka being considered the Switzerland of Asia was now over. We were entering a long civil war, which only ended in 2009. We had two or three presidents during that time. I remember there was Chandrika Kumaratunga. There was Mahinda Rajapaksa. I would like to just talk about Mahinda Rajapaksa a little bit from my perspective. I would just like once again to thank him for ending the war. I remember when I asked my father around 2008, I asked him, I said, Daddy, will this war ever end? And he said, Sean, it's going to end next year. And I was one of the few people who never thought that this was going to end because me being born in 1993, that was the only part of Sri Lanka I saw. And I remember in May, I think it was in May when the war ended, I was one of the happiest people alive because I knew the sacrifice that our soldiers laid down for our country. The operations that they conducted, sometimes suicide missions, have to be respected for generations and generations and generations to come. And this is why my movement, the reason why I'm doing this is to support Sri Lanka, to make Sri Lanka reach its true potential. And what we need to understand ultimately is that the new government that is in place today, they too have a two-third majority. What they will do is still time will tell. But I would just like to take also this opportunity to highlight that my movement, which is called Ape Jana Bala Satana, our movement is not there to do politics. Our movement is there to support people in politics, to give them the answers, to give them solutions to questions. If you go on my website, I have a manifesto which is in Sinhala, Tamil, and English. Of course, some of the videos in my podcast channel highlighted a lot of the key solutions for Sri Lanka's IT sector. I've done quite a few. However, in that manifesto, I talk about the rest, fisheries,
dairy. I will not go more into talking about what Sri Lanka needs to do. It's all highlighted in black and white there. But I would just like to also say, just to conclude, that we are here to help. If I do not see a change in the next 5 years, a change that I am satisfied with, and by the way, I'm here to help. I am clearly asking whoever is out there to support people like me to make Sri Lanka the pearl of the Indian Ocean. What I would just like to say is if we really analyze our entire history, we can clearly see where we went wrong. And the fundamental point that I want to say is there are certain policies that support in certain countries in the world that worked and certain that didn't. And unfortunately, our reliance on running things on our own, doing things in our own way, focusing on nationalizing everything, that clearly made room for corrupted practices to flourish, for people to not take their job too seriously. And this is why I just wanted to end my podcast series by talking a little bit about Sri Lanka's history to give a little bit of a perspective into why and what happened. And I'm sure we can together, if we work together, find the solutions. But everything has a start and everything has a finish. And in our case, our start was good and our current predicament is not good. And we have to have a good finish for our future generations, for the people today who are working their butts off to make sure that their sons and daughters can have a better life in Sri Lanka. I remember when the economic crisis was there was a situation where women did not have access to sanitary pads. Put aside the whole fuel matter. Sri Lankans could not eat. And that is the thing that broke my heart the most. And that is what began my journey of saying, okay, I'm not seeing anyone do this yet. I'm going to be at least the one who puts a little bit of my time and study a little bit of Sri Lanka's, ecosystem and try my level best to put it into paper so that anyone else who loves Sri Lanka just like me can join me on this journey, can help Sri Lanka on their own, or simply try to find their own way of trying to solve an issue that I myself try to solve in a certain way. And from next week onwards, we're going to be releasing some content to showcase the beauty of Sri Lanka, and also something just to put a smile on everyone's face. So, guys, thank you for your time, and I appreciate you all. Cheers.